Hello and welcome, I'm your CodeMonkey. In this lecture, we're finally going to learn what is the static keyword and what does it do. Okay, so since the very beginning, we've been working with this default code. In the beginning, I told you to just ignore the static over here. But now, since we have already learned what are classes, now we can finally start to learn what is static. In the previous video, we wrote this code, and I told you to make sure not to write static inside any of this, either the field or the function. What it means is when you define something as static, when you do that, you are making that belong to the class itself as opposed to any instance of that class. So if you make something static, like a static score field, if you do that, then now that symbol, that score, that only exists on the class itself and does not exist as a separate copy for each individual object you create of that type. So here, when we made our custom class, we wanted this function and this field, we wanted that to belong to each instance of that class. We wanted that as opposed to belonging to the class itself, so that is why we made these intentionally non-static. And by doing that, we made it so that up here, in order to call this function, we need to call the function on some kind of instance of our type. So that is why we need to create a CodeMonkey player in order to call the sayHello. And if we try doing player.sayHello, nope, this does not work. This is an error. Because we marked this as non-static means that we need an instance of our type in order to call this function. And it's the same thing for the console.writeLine that we've been using. For this one, we can inspect this function. So we can right click in here, and then let's go into this one, go to definition. And if you do that, yep, it opens up this window, which basically shows the code inside the writeLine function. And over here, we can see this function is indeed marked as static. That is why when we use it through the console class itself, meaning we never do a new console, and then using that console we call writeLine. We don't do that. Since that one is marked as static, we access the console class itself and then call the function directly on the class itself. So static means this belongs to the class itself and not any instance of that class. As to when would you use this, one example is over here on the console. It's super easy to just write console.writeLine and write something to the console. It is much easier as opposed to having to create a new console object, having to keep track of that object in order to call the function. We just access the function directly and makes it super easy to use. And then it can make sense if you have some kind of behavior or some kind of data that you want to belong to the class itself and not all the instances of that class. Like for example, if you have some kind of score that is meant to be shared between all the other objects. If so, then it might make sense to define that in class. That way we have just one score field that is shared between all the various players. In order to make something static, it's really simple. We just add the static keyword. Like for example, over here on the sayHello function, let's mark this as static. However, in doing so, we can already see two errors. There's one over here on the name and one up here on our players. So let's actually, for now, just comment out this code and let's just do player.sayHello. Yep, now this one does work because that function is now marked as static. But now the error down here on the name, like it says here, an object's reference is required for a non-static field. Object reference is really just another word for object instance. This basically means that we cannot access non-static fields whilst inside a static function. That is because, again, static means that it belongs to the class itself and not any instance. So since this function does not belong to any instance, naturally we cannot access any instance variables. That is also why, quite a while ago on the variables lecture, when we were creating some class variables up here, I said that if you want to create a variable that you want to access inside main, you need to mark it as static. If we just make an int age over here, and over here try to access age equals something, and over here try to access age equals something, nope, this does not work. We cannot access it. In order to make it work, this needs to be static because main is static. So whilst inside a static function, we can only access static fields. In order to make our code work here, we can really just mark this one as static, with the obvious side effect, which is, like I said, this field now belongs to the class itself. So with this, we could not have multiple players, each with different names. By doing this, there's pretty much just one name field, regardless of how many player instances we have. And by adding static over here, we created yet another error right here. And once again, it has to do with this keyword, which, like I said, this one refers to the object that this code is running on. But once again, this one is a static field, meaning it does not belong to any instance. So we cannot access it through a this, which refers to a specific instance. And if we remove this, then we have the exact same problem we had, which is all of these are referring to the same symbol. So we want to access this one. And as to how we access a static field, if we can't do it through this, the answer is we access it through the class name. So over here, player.name, and once again, put the cursor over in order to highlight, and yep, now it is correctly referencing these two. Okay, so we have no more errors. Now let's see what this is doing. So first, let's call player.hello, and then let's create a new CodeMonkey player, and let's print player.sayHello again, and then let's create an Ironman player, and now let's print sayHello again. Now, if you want a quick challenge, try to pause the video right now and try to guess what all of this is going to print on the console. So which name is going to be printed over here on this function call, which one on this one, and which one on this one. So if you want, pause the video right now and try to give that a go, try to get a guess. Over here, let's run the code and see what this says. And yep, it says hello nothing, then hello CodeMonkey, and finally hello Ironman. Here we can clearly see how static data belongs to the class itself and not any instance of that class. Basically, the first time we say hello, the name is going to default to a dash. so that is why it prints dash. Then we create CodeMonkey, and when creating that object, that individual instance of that object is going to access the global name field that is inside the player class, so the static field. So we're going to update that one from dash into CodeMonkey, that is why it prints that. And finally create an Ironman, and again same thing, that is going to modify and update and override the name, so the name no longer says CodeMonkey by the end, it only says Ironman. The important takeaway here is that even though we are creating two instances of that object, since over here we are accessing a static field, remember the static field belongs to the class itself, so we have just one of these even though we have two instances of our player. Now it might seem like I'm repeating myself a little bit too much in this lecture, but this really is a crucial thing to understand. The difference between making a field static or non-static, the difference between how many instances of a field you have. This is really crucial to fully understand so you don't get confused. If it's static, you have just one field that is shared between all the classes, and if it's non-static, then each instance of that type will have its own field. Like back here in the diagram, we define a static int score, and this one is basically shared between all the other objects. But then we have a non-static string name and int health, and each object has their own copy, has their own data within that field. Now, we already saw how we cannot access a non-static field from a static function, but the opposite is valid. So here on say hello, if I remove the static to make this a non-static function, and yep, there is no error down here. Whilst on a non-static function, we can indeed access static fields. Although again, remember how a static field, this one belongs to the class itself, and there's really only one field that is shared between all instances of that class. So for example, up here, let's create a new Ironman CodeMonkey. So let's actually uncomment this code up here. For example, let's create a new CodeMonkey player, then let's create an Ironman player, and then let's print hello on the CodeMonkey player itself. So once again, if you want a mini challenge, try pausing the video right now and try to guess what this one will say. And if we test, and yep, look at that. It says hello Ironman, even though we are calling the say hello on the CodeMonkey player object. And the reason is once again because this field is static. So when we create a new Ironman, that one is updating that static field to just say Ironman. So down here, when we access static field, we are accessing the only field that exists within the entire class. Now let's just learn one more tiny thing about static, which is how you can mark the class itself as static. So here you can write static class, and basically by doing this, the compiler forces you to make everything inside that class as static. So we cannot have a regular instance of our player constructor, we cannot have this, and we cannot have a non-static function. It needs to be marked as static, so just like this. So this can be helpful, for example, when you want to make sure that everything is static. If there's some kind of class, like for example the console, here if we once again right click and go to the definition, we can see, yep, the console is marked as static. You are never ever intended to create a new object of type console. That is never supposed to happen. Everything inside this console class, all of this should be static. All the functions, all the fields, all of this should be static and used as static. So in order to enforce that, you can just add the static keyword, and basically the compiler will force you to make everything within that class marked as static. So when you want that, add static. But when you want to mix between static and non-static, then just don't add it and simply add static to the things that you do want to make static. Alright, so that's static. Now if you're a beginner and you're slightly confused, go ahead and watch this lecture again. Learning the difference between static and non-static is really important. You need to fully understand the difference between what belongs to an object and what belongs to a class itself. Next, let's learn about access modifiers. This is something that is extremely important in order to write good clean code, so let's learn that in the next lecture.